something that will prove it. This is my scroll. I used to have a Geneva Bible, which was from 1599. It was really old. Dad gave it to me. I had to sell it a few years ago because I was broke and needed the money. But just to show you that the book of Job was of interest to me long ago, I did this about 30 years ago. I made a scroll. I took parchment paper, sort of like linen, and wrote down the book of Job using a, pen and nib. And I don't think I got the whole book. I ran out of room. I ran out of parchment paper. I think I got to about chapter 30. So anyway, if you want to look at what a scroll looks like, I just took parchment paper and glued it together at the edges and then wrote. And you can go from one side to another. So this is how a scroll works. They would have much bigger poles. I just use dowel sticks. But anyway, it's kind of interesting. Old English, if you want to look at it. Just pass it around. Okay, well, slight review. Job was a wealthy, godly man, and he unknowingly got involved in a spiritual contest between good and evil forces in heaven and earth. That's between God and the devil. And Job has no idea what's going on because he doesn't get to see the book and doesn't know about what happened in heaven. So one day, God summoned the Satan, the adversary angel, to report to heaven. And God brags about Job, which shows that he not only loved Job, but he was curious about what Satan thought about Job. Now, of course, God already knew, but he asks anyway. And he implied that Satan has failed to kill or corrupt this good man. And Satan snarls angrily that he can't touch Job because God's put up a hedge of protection around him. That is, as we discussed last week, a bunch of guardian angels keeping any demons from hurting him or causing him great temptation. So the devil claims that Job only loves God because God made him rich, and that if God took away his riches, he wouldn't love him anymore. And he said this in public in front of all the angels, and so God sort of sets up a contest. This is not a poker game, because a poker game implies there's a chance. God already knows what's going to happen, so there is no chance. But he knows very well that the devil has questioned Job's loyalty and God's lovability. God, nobody would love you unless you did good for them. You're not lovable in and of yourself. So God says, okay, you can test. I'll take away my hedge of protection, and you can test him, and we'll see if he still loves me after all. So God does set a limit, however. God says you cannot touch him. You can take away all of his stuff and all of his family, but you can't touch him. There's a limit. So God took away all the angels except the ones around Job himself. Well, God is not the author of evil, and yet God allows evil and uses evil. Now, we're talking about disasters, not moral evil. God doesn't create moral evil, but he does sometimes create disasters. And the one that would have been most obvious to everyone at that time was what? What disaster had just happened a couple centuries before Job? The Great Flood destroyed everything on earth. That's a big disaster, and that was from God. That was not from the Satan. So hurricanes and tornadoes and brush fires and earthquakes, these are all a result of the fall of man. They are sort of judgments, but not exactly judgments, because they're not judgments on any individual person. They're judgments on the earth. The earth was cursed as well as the humans because of our sin. So in the great flood of Noah, God destroyed all the wicked, and he also killed all the innocent animals on the earth. Here, though, God does what you might not expect in every time he allows disaster. Humans, though, we expect fairness, especially here in California, I've discovered. The growing liberal opinion in the United States claims that fairness is a human right. Fairness, though, means equality. And so the idea is it's wrong for one guy to have riches and one guy to be poor. That's evil or wrong. And therefore, to fix this wrong, we have to steal it from the rich person to give it to the poor person. Even though there's no discussion of whether the person is poor because he's lazy or crazy or folly. So fairness just means everybody should be exactly the same. So we socially engineer our systems to steal from the rich to give to the poor. We give trophies to everybody who participates because we don't want anyone to feel he's better or worse than another. Now that is fairness, that is not justice. God is righteous and just. God is not always fair because he doesn't treat everyone equally. God does not abide by human rules or human ideas of fairness, shall we say. So if we don't understand that, it's because we are wrong, not because God is wrong. We have a better understanding, though, than Job did at the time. Unless Job wrote this book, which is possible, he never did learn about this contest in heaven. All he knew was all the devastation he suffered. And then at the end, the prosperity that God returned to him. And you know what? God never explained it to Job. At the end of the book, God does not explain why he did what he did. He doesn't mention the devil, probably. He just says, hey, I'm God. Who are you? That's pretty much what he says at the end of the book. So anyway, God agreed to withdraw his guardian angels from Job's property to allow Satan to strike Job really hard. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now God did set limits on it. He didn't allow Job to be touched. But one of the main points of this book is not Job's suffering. It's the idea that you or I might suffer also. There's no reason why God has to make us prosperous or even middle class. Despite what people tell you on Christian television and Joel Osteen, you don't deserve to be rich. You don't deserve to be happy all the time. So this is one of the purposes of the book of Job, and this is part of the reason I believe why his friends went bad. His friends couldn't handle the idea that they might too suffer, and so they had to deny that it was right for him to suffer. He had to be evil. So it was a self-protection. So here's what happened when the Satan left God. This is verses 13 through 17. There was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. They killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So that's the Arabians. They show up and steal all the camels and the donkeys and killed all the servants. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, yet another servant came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took them away, yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Okay, so the Arabians got the oxen and the donkeys. The Babylonians stole the camels. But everything that Job owned is gone in one day. 2 of the attacks were from evil humans, but one of the attacks was from God. Now you might say, well, it was from Satan. Maybe. But ultimately, it was from God. God allowed it. God told the Satan he could do it, gave him permission. I'm not sure how exactly Satan can bring fire from heaven. I have trouble believing that Satan has the power of creation. So we watched a video about Sodom and Gomorrah and just how devastated that whole area was. It's just square miles of salt. Basically, the sand turned to glass. That's how hot it was. It's like a nuclear explosion. Well, I don't believe that Satan can just snap his fingers and make nuclear explosions. So I'm not sure if God actually sent the fire, or if he enabled Satan to send the fire, or if it was part of the Sodom and Gomorrah and his animals just happened to be close. But the key point of it, however it was done, is that it was from God. You see, Satan is trying to frame God for all this. Now, in a sense, he doesn't even have to frame it. In a sense, God is responsible for it. But he's saying to Job, not only do the people attack you, God attacked you. Because fire doesn't come down to heaven at the command of some guy. There's been a few people, Elijah and Elisha, could bring fire out of heaven. And James and John wanted to, but Jesus told them not to. I'm not even sure that they could have if they wanted to. But anyway, that was from God. So Job can't just say, oh, it was a bad day, a lot of bad luck, stock market crashed. Nothing like that. That's true, it did happen, but God attacked him too. He killed all the sheep and all the servants too. So it wasn't just animals. But one last guy came in verses 18 and 19. While they were yet speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are all dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So Satan saved the worst for last. With 3 consecutive messengers, the devil took away all of his property. Animals were his wealth, and they're all gone. But then Lucifer drops the big news. His kids are all dead. And worst of all, it was not humans chopping them up in an attack. It was an act of God. Wind took the house down, a natural disaster. Could have been a whirlwind like a tornado, or possibly it was related to the Sodom and Gomorrah thing, a great wind if their house was up in the north. So Satan, though, used a timing maneuver. First, he hit Job with littler things, and then he hit him with the big one at the end. Losing one child would be a heartbreaking loss. I can't imagine it because I've never had any children. But to lose a whole family in one disaster, that's an epic tragedy. And Satan framed God for it because God sends weather. And it was a weather event. We call it I shouldn't say we, but in the insurance industry, they call that an act of God. Not by accident. It's just something you can't predict. Well, so what Job has to face then is that God destroyed his family and his livelihood. Satan swore before the angels. He swore that if God struck Job's possessions, Job would surely curse God to his face. So how did Satan's prediction work out? And that's where we come to this week in verses 20 through 22. Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. Now, this is one of the most stunning surprises in human history. You just can't imagine it. It seems impossible to me and to most readers. Far from cursing God, Job worshipped and praised the name of the Lord. It doesn't seem normal, probably because it isn't normal. Most of us, if we were to face all these disasters, would not react this well. But Job shows the kind of man he was. Now, apparently, Job had been seated when the messengers came in, because it says he stood up or he arose. So he got up from his seat, and then he tore his robe and shaved his head. Now, presuming we're correct that Job was written before Genesis, and that Job was around the time of Abraham, this is the first time in the Bible that anyone tears their robes. Anthropologists propose, I looked at some theories about why ancient peoples tore their robes. They proposed that tearing your clothes was a way of opening your garment so that your soul could escape to heaven when you died. I don't know, I think that's kind of silly. If you believe in a soul, it's obviously not part of your body, so having clothes over it isn't going to hold it in. So I think the anthropologists are being goofy. But anyway, another theory is that clothes were very expensive. For most people, clothing would be a big part of their income. You might only have 1 or 2 pairs of clothes in your whole life. So tearing it shows just how upset you are. You're willing to destroy something very valuable because you've lost something very valuable. Maybe, but to Job was rich. So he had lots of clothes. So tearing his robe wouldn't do anything except a social statement to the public. It's a display of grief, you could say, of course. But my opinion is that it's related to the clothing from the Garden of Eden, or at least the purpose of clothing in the Garden of Eden. Remember, God is the one who clothed people. But clothes were not needed in the Garden of Eden until the fall. Before sin, Adam and Eve were naked all the time. And there's a famous bumper sticker that I like. It says, God's plan was to live with a bunch of naked vegetarians in a garden. That's a bumper sticker. And that's actually true. That was sort of his plan. But when they sinned, you see, the reason they didn't need clothes is because the climate was very nice, was very warm and pleasant, just the right humidity, apparently all the time. Or possibly, even if the climate changed somewhat between day and night, they didn't need clothes because their bodies might have been more adaptable to changes in temperature. They were still untainted by sin. But once they sinned, Adam and Eve tried to make clothes for themselves out of what? Fig leaves, which are big, giant leaves. And I'm not sure how they did it, but somehow they tried to sew together some fig leaves so that they could cover their shame which didn't exist until they had sinned. Then Jesus came and called and said, "Where are you?" And they were hiding. He says, "Well, we were hiding from you." "Well, why were you hiding from me?" Anyway, then Jesus kills some animals, the first death on earth. Kills some animals and clothes them. So he took away their silly fig leaf clothing and gave them clothing from dead animals. And this is probably how they learned to use animals for clothing, because Jesus showed them how. But anyway, now your human body is naked. And so after you've sinned, you have to cover yourself with warmth or bring a personal heater, because you're sinners. I'm just playing with you. But anyway, it's true, it wouldn't be cold if we hadn't sinned. So aside from sin, we'd all be walking around naked. And this is what Job seems to say. We were born naked. Right? So that's your normal state. Without the fall, you'd be naked. So I think that tearing the robes and shaving the head are symbolizing your original state. I was born naked. I'm going to be naked again when I die. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But it seems odd to us to think of being naked in death, because in our society, at every funeral I've ever been to or heard of, the cadaver is clothed. You know, you got an open casket. And so you're not ogling the dead body naked. You're seeing the dead body clothed. That's our tradition here. But you know, there's a wide variety of practices around the world. I read some really bizarre ones. There's some headhunters in Indonesia, I think it is. And whenever they have a body around, they let all the flesh rot off, and then they tie the skeleton together and hang it from the cliffs so that the skeletons are always looking down on them. Oh, yeah, that's nice. So burial practices vary from country to country. I wouldn't go for that one, really. But anyway, Job was not exactly Jewish, but he was from that region. He's what we call a Semitic people, Middle East, and they all had similar traditions. So I'll tell you what we know about the Jewish and Semitic traditions of that time, and it's hard to say whether this goes all the way back. All we know is that this is the way they do things now, or we have some indications even in the Bible of how they did things. But the human body to the Jews and the Semitic people was considered to be sacred, and that's because we were made in the image of God. Now, I don't think anybody's ever really understood what the image of God is. I have an opinion, but there's no reason to go into it now. But a lot of people believe that the image of God was something to do with your body. The Jews have one odd idea, that the image of God is standing on 2 feet, because all the animals walk around on 4 feet or 8 feet or 6 feet. We only have 2 feet. Of course, then if you throw in orangutans who walk on their back feet, it doesn't work too well with. Anyway, the Jews didn't know about orangutans. But they did not do any embalming. They didn't do like the Egyptians. You know, the Egyptians would drain out your blood and open holes in your bones and take your brain out and take your heart out and take your liver out and put them in little jars, canopus jars. That's the whole mummy movie. I learned that. But actually they used to do that. That's how Egyptians did burial practices. And so then they mummified the body by using embalming fluids so it would last longer. But the Jews didn't do that because the Jews didn't believe in any desecration of the human body. No dissections, no making holes, no draining blood. So you had a quick burial. The reason you need a quick burial if you're not embalming is because if you've ever seen a dead deer on the side of the road or a dead cow, what happens after a day or two? It stinks and it inflates and it explodes sometimes because the gases inside start going rotten, and as the gases expand, eventually the body just goes, bloop, pops out. So pretty nasty. So if you don't embalm a body, like the Jews didn't embalm, you had the funeral that day or the next day. You didn't wait long. Just as Jesus went to see the body of Lazarus, and they said, he's been buried, he's been dead 4 days. If you open that, it's going to stink. He said, open it anyway. But anyway, this is the way the Jews did it. If somebody died, they took the body. The first step is undress it, wash it thoroughly so that it's totally clean, and then wrap it in old rags or cloths, clean cloths. Like a baby, swaddling cloths in a sense, long strips of cloth. So then they put it in a grave. Usually the grave was a cave. A family would usually have a cave that they buried all the bodies in. And so they take the body and leave it in there for a couple of years, and then they take it back out once all the flesh and stuff was gone, and take the bones and put them in small ossuary boxes. That's because you'd run out of room if you had bones everywhere eventually. So anyway, this is Jewish burial practices. So when you die, you strip the body, wash it, wrap it in cloths, and put it in a cave. Now what does that mean? Well, for Job, it means really bad news. It means he and his wife, and any servants he has left who are loyal to them, which is at least 4, have to go to the house of the oldest son, dig the bodies out of the rubble, wash them all, wrap them in cloth, and take them to the cave, all in one day, or at least within the next day. Otherwise, they'll be rotting. So they have to go through the rubble and find the crushed bodies of their kids and probably grandkids. I would imagine some of them had other family members already. They had their own homes. So that would be really rough. Stripping the bodies of the children, washing them, wrapping them in cloth, and burying them all in one day. But that's still coming in the future here. This is his first statement of mourning. He tore his robe to show his grief and nakedness before the power of death. Now in America, though, we don't do this. We cheat death, or we try to cheat death. The super wealthy have 2 modern ways of seeking immortality. This is very interesting. I looked up how do people try to cheat death. If you're rich enough, the big choice that's been going on for 20 or 30 years now is called cryonics. Cryonics is the science of freezing things. I went to a demonstration in a museum where they showed cryonics. They had like liquid nitrogen in a beaker, and they stuck a rose in it, and it instantly froze. And he took it out, and it still looked like a rose, and he goes, ding, and the flowers fall off. It shattered because it turned into glass, basically. Well, that's what you do with your body if you're rich enough. When you die and you're rich, you paid them to take you to this cryonics tube and freeze you. And the reason is, the idea is that maybe 100 or 200 years in the future, science will be advanced enough that they can unfreeze you like a frog. There are some frogs you can freeze for like 100 years and they'll wake up later. So the theory is they'll unfreeze your body and they'll jolt you with some kind of shock and your brain will come back on and you'll be alive again. That's their hope. Most people think it's a load of crud. There's another idea now, though, that's going on, not cryonics. It's actually related to computers, of course. The idea is that you somehow put all of your thoughts and feelings and ideas into a computer program. And someday, they'll be building androids, and they can take your ideas out of your computer program and send it into the android, and then you'll be basically an eternal android. Because, you know, if your leg starts to go bad, you just stick on a new leg. So these are the two ideas that Americans have who are rich to cheat death. And it's also what I would call denial. You see, denial that death will get us all. You know that every person, well, with a couple of small exceptions, every person who's ever lived has died. It's pretty much inevitable. Ever since the fall, our bodies, it's called entropy, our bodies gradually deteriorate. From the moment you're born, you start deteriorating. You get bigger, but it doesn't mean you're getting better. You might think you're getting better, but you're just getting older. Every day is another day closer to your death. It's always our destiny. The only people to ever live forever, we think, are Enoch and Elijah, who never died, their bodies. So even Jesus' body died, but was raised again. So anyway, if you're trying to save your body for all eternity with cryonics or artificial intelligence, you're just being foolish. It's not going to work, or at least God's not going to allow it to work, because death is the final enemy that Jesus conquered. So the key to death is to make sure you're going to get resurrected, not that you're going to be frozen or computerized. So anyway, Job, he knows this himself. He knows about resurrection. We won't talk about that for a few months at least. That's in chapter 19, where he says, I know that when I die, I will then see God with my own eyes. So if you've got eyes, you've got a body back. So he understands a little bit about resurrection. How that is, I don't know, because in early Genesis, we have no indication of that. So God had to have told them, or somehow they worked it out. But anyway, when he gets all the bad news, Job tears his robe, took a blade and shaved off all of his head. This is another symbol of nakedness and mourning. You see, back in Semitic days, the people having long hair was sort of, not a privilege, it was honorable. You wanted to have a long beard and long hair because it showed you were in good shape and you could clean yourself. But when you're in mourning or grief, you cut it all off to show that you're not so blessed at the moment. But then the text says, he fell to the ground and worshipped. Now, falling to the ground, you can understand. You might think that he just fainted. You know, the shock of all the bad news all at one time just make you fall on the ground out of shock. But this isn't fainting, because obviously he stood up, he tore his robe, and then he shaved his head. If you were just going to faint, you're not going to shave your head first. You're just going to collapse. This was preparation for worship. And my guess is that worship was Job's default mode. You know, the reason we practice, if you want to have a firearm, for example, you spend a lot of time practicing. And the reason is, if a situation ever comes where you have to use your gun, you've already gotten the idea of pulling it out of the holster and aiming it and cocking it and all that. You've got to have it practiced. And so my theory is that Job was so used to worshiping God all the time that it just, nothing else occurred to him. What you do when something happens, good or bad, is you worship. So I think that's how this happened. It was just his habit to be a man of worship. I mean, think about it, even in what we know about him. When Job's kids were having celebrations, what did he do? He prayed and he made sacrifices. Those are forms of worship. Now bad things happen, and what is there to do? Job worships. It's just what he does when things happen. This is not the kind of man that Satan has run into before. He was right in a sense. He was right about probably 99% of the people on earth. God, if you make this guy suffer a lot, he will hate you. And that's true of most people. But Job didn't hate God. Now, think of other people that, even good people that Satan has run into before. Think, for instance, of Noah. Okay, Noah was a great man. In the book of in Ezekiel, it says that God, if there were these three righteous men, they would still be in trouble. Noah and Job and Daniel. So Noah's one of the three most righteous guys to ever live. That's why God saved him and his family in the ark. Well, what did Noah do after he got out of the ark and all the animals left and he made his sacrifices and God brought the rainbow? Then what did Noah do? He planted a vineyard and he got drunk and he ran around naked. And his kids saw him and one of them despised him for running around naked. So bad things happen to Noah. He handles it a long time, but when he finally sits down and has some time on his hands, he gets so upset he drinks himself into a stupor and runs around naked. So these are the kind of guys that Satan's used to. Eventually they'll crack. Well, Job didn't crack, at least not yet. He will a little later, but not yet. So he didn't drown his sorrows in alcohol or any of that. But Job has experienced a lot more personal things than Noah did. The disaster for Noah, he kept his family in the ark all safe and sound. And all the wicked died. So he probably didn't care that much. I mean, it's sad in a sense, but they were wicked and violent and evil. So in a sense, God was cleansing the earth, and Noah understood that. But Job, he got just the opposite. You see, in the flood, all the wicked died, and all the righteous survived. In this case, a lot of righteous people just died, and a lot of wicked people are still all around him, and they're still rich. Everything's backwards. This isn't the way God works. And that's why this book is so confusing. Which righteous people survived? Just Job and his wife. So when do you worship God? I mean, do you worship God only on Sunday mornings? From 9:30 to 1 o'clock? Is that our worship time? If you made it your habit to worship God all the time, you might have more patience like Job when bad things happen. Because you would realize that God is still to be worshipped when bad things happen too. That doesn't occur to us normally. You see, Job worshipped when he was rich. Job worshipped when he worked. Job worshipped with his family. It was his routine. It was habitual. So when disaster struck, he was ready to worship still. And it tells us exactly how he worshiped. It says that Job spoke he said one of the most profound sentences ever uttered. Naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked shall I return there. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So the first thing Job notes is the transitory, temporary nature of his body. I came into the world naked. I had nothing when I got here. Nothing except a mother and a name. Actually, the Jews didn't always name their babies at birth, sometimes. So he has nothing. And he knows that when he dies, somebody is going to strip his body naked, wash him clean, although when he gets leprosy, they might not do that. Anyway, he doesn't know the leprosy's coming yet. So as far as he knows, they're going to strip him naked, wash him, wrap him in cloths, and put him in the family cave. That's the womb of the earth. So it's almost like Nicodemus was being kind of obtuse and taking Job literally. You remember Nicodemus when Jesus told him you have to be born again? He says, what do you mean? Can I go back into my mother's womb again? Give me a break. I don't think woman here wants to hear about that. So he's saying not that he's going back to his mother's womb. He's probably implying he's going into the womb of the earth, so to speak. But this passage is the original or earliest reference to the idea of you can't take it with you. I came into the world with nothing. I will leave the world with nothing. So let's talk about some other Bible writers who had this idea later. If you look at Ecclesiastes 5:15, this is King Solomon the Wise. And he takes Job almost exactly word for word. Ecclesiastes 5:15. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came. And he shall take nothing from all his labors to carry away in his hand. In other words, I came into the world with nothing, and when I die, I'm not taking any of it with me. How are you going to take it with you? You're dead. You're not taking anything anywhere. Then in in the book of Luke, Jesus told a parable in chapter 12 about a rich man who built bigger and bigger barns because he had so much wealth he needed more barns to store it all for the future. But then Jesus says suddenly he died and he couldn't take any of the barns or the grain with him. Another statement basically of what Job said. And finally, this is in Paul also, in 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 and 7. 1 Timothy 6, 6 and 7. Godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we carry nothing out. So Job was the first to speak this way, with what is obviously godly wisdom, thinking not only of the past, but of the future. I was naked in the past, and I will be naked in the future. By the way, in the new heavens and the new earth, I don't know, will we be naked? Not sure. Well, according to Chrysostom, he was one of the early church fathers, a great preacher. Job was able to endure these losses because Job knew that none of it belonged to him. It all belonged to God. So how can you grieve its loss if it wasn't yours anyway? If you have that perspective on your things, you won't be so upset if you ever lose them. It's not that you're supposed to be a stoic and not care about anything, but the fact of the matter is God has made us stewards, and the idea of tithing, in fact, comes from stewardship. You give back a portion and God lets you keep the rest. But none of it's yours. It's that God gave it to you, all of it. So mourning its loss isn't proper. This works pretty well, though, how Job handled the loss of his possessions. Camels and sheep and oxen and donkeys, they were Job's wealth. They were his business. But it does get trickier. I'm not pretending this is easy. It gets trickier when you consider the servants who were killed from fire from heaven and the children and grandchildren who died in a natural disaster. It's easy enough to say, all my books aren't mine. My books are my prized possession. They all burn? Yeah, I'd probably be upset. But they're not mine. I just have them for a while. But kids and other people are a different matter. We can't look at them just like, losing your dog in a fire. Losing your child or your mate in a fire would be far worse. And obviously, they don't belong to Job. He doesn't own them. People belong to God alone. But when it gets tricky is this, when you ask, how can God kill or allow to be killed dozens of other people to test one man? All right, so let's say on that day when all the kids die, they go to heaven, hopefully, and they say to God, what's going on? Why did you kill us just to test Job? That's kind of a valid question. And I really can't answer it. I'm guessing that the way God will answer it is that it was your time. You had done in the world what I intended for you to do, and now you will enjoy my presence forever. But it's not an easy thing to say. Even especially the servants, at least the kids, they were related to Job, but I just worked for Job. Why am I dead? How's that fair? Actually, in Egypt, and for some wealthy people, in the old days, if you had a slave and the rich person died, they killed the slaves and buried them with them because they thought in the afterlife you'd be resurrected and you needed servants to help you. So you don't want to work for a rich guy because they're going to cut your throat as soon as your boss dies. That's kind of a contract you don't want to sign. But again, I do have to point out that fairness is not God's attribute. God has attributes like justice, mercy, love, truth. These are attributes of God. Fairness is not an attribute. It is a theory of equality. But the question isn't entirely invalid. God wants to prove that Job is loyal, so he kills his servants and relatives. It doesn't sound fair, and it isn't fair, but it is just. You see, God is in anything he does or allows the Satan to do. The problem is that we just don't understand how that works. Later in the book, Job is going to start cracking, and he starts demanding justice from God. God, you are being unjust to me. I demand a hearing. Come down here now. Bad God. That's what Job starts saying toward the end of the book. And later in the book, when he falls apart, guess who comes? Jesus comes to speak to Job out of the whirlwind. And how does Jesus explain himself to Job? He doesn't. God basically says, I'm the creator, I'm in charge of the whole universe, and what do you know about anything? That's not a real sweet, kind answer, but it's the truth. And why is it the truth? Why doesn't God explain himself to Job? Because we can't understand it, even if he explains it to us. Do you understand the difference between God and humans? There are several places in the Bible, like in Isaiah, for instance, where God says, God looks down on the earth and we're like grasshoppers. We are far closer to grasshoppers by nature than we are to God. We're way low on the totem pole. If there's a totem pole with, slugs near the bottom, or plants, and then slugs, and then maybe monkeys, and then humans, and then angels, and then God. They're way up there on that totem pole somewhere out billions of light years away. We're down on the bottom. We are created life forms. We're made out of flesh and blood, like bugs and other creatures. We're closer to them than we are to God. So, here's one of the challenges. There was a fellow, I can't remember his name, it'll come up later. But one commentator said, we would have more luck capturing a cockroach and explaining to it the theory of relativity by Einstein and did understanding. We'd have better luck doing that than God would have explaining himself to us. That's how far beyond us he is. So basically, we're like cockroaches scurrying around, and we demand an answer, and God says, you're not capable of an answer. As Jack Nicholson said in the movie, you can't handle the truth. Even if he tries to give it to you, you can't handle it. You won't understand it, because we have monkey brains. So anyway, one general principle, though. I'm not saying that it is inexplicable. It is a mystery because we can't handle it. But it's not that there's not an answer. God has the answer, it's just we can't understand it. So here is one general principle that we can grasp a little bit. It's that God acts for his own glory. That's the basic truth behind all of creation, all affliction. What is the chief end of man in the Westminster Confession of Faith? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. Now, enjoying him forever is a benefit of the first part, glorifying God. I mean, we're glad that that is a part of glorifying God. But the fact of the matter is, everything on earth glorifies God. I think it was Jeremiah Burroughs who said, you either glorify God by your life, or he will glorify himself upon your life. You're going to glorify him one way or another. It's just whether you enjoy it or hate it is going to be the difference. So let's talk about that principle of glorifying God. It's best found in 1 Peter. If you turn to 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. We have some inspired words here that explain why does God cause us affliction. 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7. Near the back of the Bible. All right, verses 6 and 7. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by many trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love. So let's break this verse down a little bit. Peter tells his readers they can rejoice in their trials of fire. Why? Because they prove that your faith is genuine. Okay, and what good does that do, proving that your faith is genuine? Because that brings praise, honor, and glory to Jesus Christ. So if you apply this to Job, what does it mean? Job, I'm not going to say he's rejoicing, but he is worshiping God despite his trials. Because it proves that his faith is genuine, and he proves that in this case. Satan's going to go back a defeated enemy when he gets back to heaven. And the genuineness of his faith brings praise, glory, and honor to God. And it's done so now for thousands of years, as long as we've had this book of Job. So that was God's purpose in a nutshell that we can understand. The details are harder, but in general, it was for God's glory. Now, Peter, we don't know exactly when he wrote this letter, but there was a lot of Roman persecution going on, like Nero. And here's some examples of the kind of persecution that Peter's friends faced. Nero used to take Christians, tie them up, dip them in wax and fuel, and then string them up on a light post and light them on fire so they could light the streets of Rome. Human torches on poles. That's the kind of thing that Peter is talking about, your trials by fire. And what good does that do? How did that persecution stamp out Christianity? No, in fact, a lot of people turned to God because of it, because they had never seen anyone die for their faith. The Romans, they had all kinds of gods, but they weren't going to die for any of them. Here's these people dying for this one God, this Jesus they were talking about. And so God was glorified by his people dying. It doesn't make it any easier for the person who's in flames on a pole, but it does bring glory to God. That's a hard truth. So Christopher Ash is a commentator on Job. He said that the glory of God is more important than your joy or your comfort. In other words, if God will get more glory by bringing harm upon you than by bringing good upon you, he might do it. Philip Yancey wrote a best-selling Christian book. It's very good. I just finished reading it this week. It's called Where is God When It Hurts? And he says that Americans in particular seem to believe, quote, that the whole purpose of life is to be comfortable. Isn't that true? Just think of all the comforts we brought to ourselves. I mean, I've been to Asia and Africa and where else? Russia. And all first world nations, our first priority is to be comfortable. Even if we're not always happy, we're at least comfortable. We've got climate control, so the temperature is always warm enough or cold enough for us. We've got air conditioning and heaters. We've got cars to bring us everywhere so we don't have to walk and get hit by rain. I mean, we've got all kinds of comforts, and a lot of people don't have all those comforts. Well, isn't that true, though? We have entertainment galore, climate control galore, pills galore, safe spaces, political correctness. No one is ever allowed to see or hear or feel anything that might make them uncomfortable. That's the excuse that college and high school kids are using now. He made me feel uncomfortable. How sad. Hardly anybody in history is worried about that. Only kings and queens get to complain about how people treat them, not everybody. Think about this. We cry about utter nonsense while other people are dying of starvation and persecution. We're complaining that somebody made us feel bad. You know, if the United States of America, if we were hit by electromagnetic pulse bombs in the atmosphere, and our electrical grid went out for more than a month, I would guess that about 75% of our population would die. They have no way to find food, get water out of the ground, it's all electrically pumped. We would all die, or most of us would die. The computers, yep. A lot of our utilities are entirely controlled by computers. I mean, when the heat goes out here in Eureka, I can go out to my little, or Dad's little trailer, the little Bambi Airstream, and turn on the kerosene. So that'll give me a couple of days of warmth. But everybody else is going to be cold. Anyway, we're coddled at every turn. We have no idea of what hunger really means. When I was in Africa, I lost 30 pounds in 30 days because I was living on nuts and mangoes. That's all they had. Occasionally, I'd find a can of tuna, and I would just chop it open and eat it raw because I was starving. I mean, I wasn't really starving, not compared to them, but anyway, a famous pastor, he was a German theologian. His name was Helmut Thielicke. He was a pastor in Nazi Germany, but he refused to join the fascist-controlled German National Church, which was the Hitler-controlled church. He stayed mainly in Stuttgart in hiding because the Gestapo was chasing him. But the Allies bombed it out in 1944. The whole city burned pretty much. So he went to other places. He traveled from city to city preaching and teaching, always chased by the Gestapo. I mean, that's a tough life for a pastor. But after the war, he became a theology professor in Hamburg. But in the 1970s, he was invited to the United States to meet President Jimmy Carter and Billy Graham. And he stayed a few months and preached at various churches. And at the end of his tour, when he was getting ready to go home to Germany in, I think, 1979, he was asked this question: what would you say is the greatest deficiency of the churches in the United States? Well, that's an interesting question, because he was new, he'd never been to America. And here's what he said: the greatest problem in the churches in the United States is that they have an inadequate view of suffering. We have no idea what suffering is. I mean, some of you might think that you've suffered. I've suffered to some degree, but compared to most people in the world, we haven't suffered anything. We're like Job. We've got our wealth. I mean, even somebody in America, in the lower middle class, they still have a cell phone. They still have a place to live, usually, if they want one. So he was being polite. I'd say he was understating it. We don't have an inadequate view of suffering. We have a wrong view of suffering, or no view of suffering at all. We're in denial about it. We have no view of suffering. We're all supposed to be happy and joyful all the time. That's the idea that Christians have, and it's wrong. We're not always supposed to be saying we and dancing around. Suffering does exist. We cure it, though, or we hide it. We hide it with entertainment. We hide it with pills. If anyone in the church is really suffering, we have to find a quick way to fix them. Get them counseling quick before they flip out. We can't have them making us nervous. We'll get nervous when people get suffering. We don't want to deal with suffering. Send them to the mental hospital or something. Get them out of our way. We can't bear to have suffering in our sight. Why is that? Because unconsciously we fear it could happen to us. If it happened to this other Christian, it could happen to me. And I can't deal with that. So I'm not going to watch that person anymore. I can't deal with that. That's the way his friends would be. They show up to help and they panic. Job is just too far gone to be helped. We can't help him. If we try to sympathize with him, then we have to admit that we might face such struggles. Can't do that. So he must be evil. God must be punishing him. And I'm not evil, so I'll be fine. It's denial. Do you realize that pain and suffering are the normal conditions in the world? Most people are either dirt poor or hungry or in some kind of sickness because they don't have food or they don't have health care or they live in a wicked communist socialist dictatorship system. Any way you look at it, most of the people in the world are suffering. And we're not. And so we have no view of it. One of the things that's most eye-opening about my travels around the world, there's lots of weird things about traveling the world, but the one that struck me the most was time. We have this view of time. You notice I don't wear a wristwatch anymore? There's a couple of reasons for that, but the big one is when I went around the world, nobody wears wristwatches. They have phones. They can look at the time. But things happen when everyone's there. You know, church doesn't start at 10 a.m. I would get a taxi to the church in Africa and get there at 10 a.m. because that's when it was scheduled. It didn't usually start till noon. When enough people showed up, then they had the service. They're not worried about the time. And then you sit there for all day. I mean, they didn't come 50 miles in a taxi or walk in 20 miles to have a 30-minute sermon. They want hours of preaching because they came all this way. So that was the thing that shocked me was the time. But the other thing is that the people are so poor, they don't know when the next meal's coming. You know, if you made enough money today, if you made an extra 50 cents, you can buy something, some nuts or some mangoes and eat them. So they're skinny. But anyway, everyone in the world is suffering, mostly except us. Now, Bernie Sanders' solution is to steal all the money from the billionaires and give it to all the poor people. Of course, then your tax base will be gone. But anyway, that's the future. We're not worried about the future. We're worried about getting elected now. But we have no idea of suffering. There are a lot of wimps in our church. I don't mean just this building. I mean the Christian church in general. I hope that Jesus takes them to heaven before the tribulation because they're going to die. They won't survive the tribulation. I don't even believe in the rapture before the tribulation, but I'm just being silly. But they would melt. They can't face suffering, and they know it subconsciously, and so they want to escape first. So I'm not seeing a lot of hope that we're going to survive persecution. You know, there probably is persecution coming. Jesus said we will all face persecution if we support Jesus. And California is likely to be one of the first places that starts occurring when people publicly relate that we're against sin. That makes us evil. You're not allowed to be against anything. So the last thing I want to point out, though, regarding Job's first speech, this is technical, but I think it's also critical. 3 times in this verse, Job calls God the name Yahweh. That's translated Jehovah in your Bibles usually. Now that in itself is nothing special because you know Jehovah or Yahweh is found 6,824 times in the Old Testament. 6,824. It is the most common name of God in the Bible. In fact, it's 3 times more than any other name of God. So there's nothing weird from the sign of the whole Bible that Job would say Yahweh 3 times. What's weird is the word Yahweh is only used 4 times in the whole book. 3 of them are in this one verse. And one of them is back in chapter 12, verse 9. You see, the word Yahweh or the name Yahweh, this is God's personal name. This is the one he tells Moses. When Moses says, "Who should I tell the Israelites sent me?" Tell him Yahweh has sent you. I am. And this name of God usually means, it's usually used in context of the covenant between God and man. In other words, my name means I have a relationship with you. I am, you are. I am, you are. So Job is using God's personal name. So here's basically what Job said in this one verse. I missed it here. Let me get back onto my notes. I was getting out of line. So Job uses it 3 times in this verse. Everywhere else, though, Job uses the names El for God, Elohim for gods, and El Shaddai, which is God Almighty. In other words, throughout the rest of the book, when Job collapses, he doesn't call God Yahweh anymore, his personal name. It's as if Job knows, right now I've got a personal relationship with God. So he says, the Lord blessed. Okay, what's the verse? How does the verse go?
The Lord gives and the
Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Yahweh gives, Yahweh takes away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. My God. My God gave stuff to me. My God took stuff away from me. My God will still be blessed. I still bless him. In the rest of the book, what does he say? That God, the mighty God, the powerful God, the God who created things, he's out there. But he's not my God anymore. He's turned on me. He's not there yet, though. At this point, he's still my God. But later, he turns on God and doesn't call him by his name anymore. He calls him descriptive names instead of his personal name. I think that's very significant. I don't think it's a coincidence. When tragedies strike, Job stands firm, and he still thinks Yahweh is his personal covenant friend God. So 3 times in this verse he says it, and he's not going to say it again except once. And the next time he says it, he just says, yeah, I know you know the name of God. Nothing personal to him about it. So chapter 1 ends with this summary statement. In all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. The Satan was wrong about Job. Job did not love God because of all of his possessions. All of Job's wealth is gone, and most of his family is gone, and yet Job still loves God. Satan said he will curse you. And what's Job doing? He's blessing him. This is very similar to the situation where King Balak of Moab tried to hire Balaam to curse the people of Israel. You remember the donkey stopped him. The angel stopped the donkey. And anyway, when Balaam gets to Balak, Balak says, okay, I'm paying you lots of money to curse the people of Israel. And God says, if you curse Israel, I'm going to kill you. So instead, Balaam blesses Israel. And the king's angry. Balak says, what are you doing? I paid you to curse him. And Balaam says, I can't curse him. God's going to kill me. But then he takes Balak aside and says, you know how you can get rid of these Jews? Make them sin. Send a bunch of hookers down there with lots of food. That'll take care of it. So he publicly blessed the people of Israel and then secretly cursed them. Well, here Job, he doesn't curse God. The devil expected him to curse God, and he didn't do it. He praised God. So now we're finished with chapter 1. It took 6 weeks, but we did cover lots of introductory material like the ancient world, angels and demons, and the challenge in heaven. So next week we will start the second scene in heaven, which is in chapter 2, between God and Satan. Would you pray for us, Mike Shoemaker?
Father, thank you for this time together and hear your word. We thank you for our study of the Old Testament. Father, we ask your blessing on the remaining portion of the service this morning and our meal at noontime. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.